One is that philosophical reasoning affirms the conclusion, and spiritual experience also confirms that conclusion. In the same ground, Aurobindo also shows now that philosophically the integral philosophy is defensible, and this integral philosophy is also supported by an integral experience of reality. And this integral experience of reality is not for the first time fabricated by Aurobindo. It is yogically verified right from the time of the Veda and Upanishads and the Gita. So this is the ground on which this solidity of this position stands. But in the meantime, in this chapter that we are reading, Sri Aurobindo speaks of this affirmation of inactive Brahman, and Sri Aurobindo says that the consequences of this affirmation are perilous. And that's a very strong criticism of this affirmation of this inactive Brahman. Perilous because if reality is really inactive and only inactive, and if the world is really an illusion, if recoil from the world is the only meaning, then you can conceive the consequences of it upon the entire morale of the people who hear the voice of the ascetic. The greatest minds who are capable of doing the greatest works on the earth for the advancement of the earth evolution are bound to leave the world and return only to the inactive Brahman and give up all activities of life ultimately, renounce. The consequence would be that the world as it is left to the second-rate and third-rate people who are moving round and round into the chain of desire and ambition and rivalries. And if you look at the history of India, you'll find that this is exactly what happened. After Buddhism and after the Shankara's philosophy both became very dominant in India, the result has been one message: leave the world, turn to the inactive Brahman. This world has no meaning, it has no purpose, nothing is to be done in the world. World is prapancha, and always it will remain so, and there is no liberation while working in the world, in spite of Gita. The Gita's teaching stands, and everybody worships Gita, and yet, in spite of that message which was given to Arjuna, where Sri Krishna told Arjuna not to leave the world, not to withdraw from action, and to do the action because the divine himself wills the action, and Sri Krishna himself speaks of the divine will in the world. In spite of that teaching, the teaching of Buddhism and Shankara's philosophy became so prominent in the history of India that Gita's teaching also came to be, you might say, understood or interpreted by different philosophers in their own different ways, and somehow the responsibility that should come upon human beings to act in the world, that was diminished and even ultimately eliminated. As Aurobindo says, the call, even in the Vaishnavism, call was through Vrindavana. It was not to Vrindavana to be created on the earth. It was to that Vrindavana which eternally exists, and you return to that Vrindavana. So even dynamic philosophies also ultimately fell in line and saying that ultimately nothing fundamentally great is to be done in the world. At the most, when you are living in the world, do your best and prepare yourself to leave the world. Because even renunciation of the world is also not an easy task. But it is said the only task to be done in the world is to be capable of renouncing the world. Now, just as in the case of materialism, Sri Aurobindo, after showing the limitations of materialism, points out the services that materialism has rendered and wants us to derive from materialism whatever truth lies in materialism and retain it in the integrality of all the truths. Similarly, in the case of this philosophy too, Sri Aurobindo wants to derive from this philosophy the utmost which is true and which must remain and which must be a part of the integrality of life. So if you read the last paragraph of that chapter, for an age out of sympathy, for an age out of sympathy with the ascetic spirit, and throughout all the rest of the world, the hour of the anchorite may seem to have passed or to be passing. It is easy to attribute this great trend to the failing of vital energy in an ancient race tired out by its burden. Its once vast share in the common advance, exhausted by its many-sided contribution to the sum of human effort and human knowledge. But we have seen that it corresponds to a truth of existence, a state of conscious realization which stands at the very summit of our possibility. In practice also, the ascetic spirit is an indispensable element in human perfection, and even its separate affirmation cannot be avoided so long as the race has not, at the other end, liberated its intellect and its vital habits from subjection to an always insistent animation. Today, when we look at asceticism, which this philosophy has given rise to in India, one might like to condemn very hastily. In fact, most of the Westerners, when they criticize India, one's particular target of the criticism is world requires dynamism, India only teaches quietism. And it ultimately only teaches you that the world is an illusion, and the greatest message is to withdraw from the world, and therefore the philosophy of India is useless for the world. This is the one great criticism which is made of Indian philosophy by those who look upon the message of the ascetic as the only message of India. It is in that context that some apologists of India, they point out that it is because Indian race at a given time became exhausted after a long labor of output and activity, which was manifested in the time of the Veda and the Upanishad and the Gita. After long labor, there was an exhaustion which came upon India, and the theory of Buddhism and the theory of Shankara's Vedanta was only an expression of that tiredness. Therefore, these two philosophies reflected fatigue of Indian race and preached in India the gospel of inaction. This apology is not absolutely valid. It is not because India had become exhausted. The truth of the Buddhistic philosophy of non-being, Sri Aurobindo says, is a truth. The truth of inactive Brahman is a truth. It is not as if a falsehood was preached. Both the theory of non-being and the theory of the being, both being inactive, corresponds to the truth of the highest possibility of human consciousness. Therefore, we should not condemn these philosophies in the way in which these philosophies tend to be condemned by those who don't understand really the significance of these two great systems of philosophy. They both aim at exploration. In that exploration, they did find non-being to be the summit, and they declared it. The experience of the inactive Brahman is certainly found to be at the summit. It has been declared. Jainism, which also speaks of inactivity at the end, also corresponds to a real experience of the inactivity. The Jivatman is experienced to be ultimately entirely inactive. Therefore, it is an affirmation of a truth. And that truth has got to be understood properly. Of course, the results have been perilous, but if you consider India as a laboratory in which Indians dared to make experiments with regard to all the domains of spiritual experience, then this experiment also should be given its proper value. We must understand that in the totality of the experiences obtained, if you ask a question, how many experiences of the ultimate reality can you count? Then if you are not to count this as an experience, it would be not that rich sum of experiences as it ought to be. So from the point of view of the total richness of spiritual experiences, of which we have an account in Indian history, its place is very great. And Sri Aurobindo says that while today we may like to condemn it, but we should not fall into the line only of condemnation of it. We must see the truth of it, appreciate it, even emphasize it. Even in our total experience, it must have its own place. In Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the attainment of inactivity of Brahman is an indispensable step in the totality. You cannot have integral experience of reality without having its foundation in this inactive Brahman. Therefore, in the path of integrality of yoga, the experience of silence, quietude, utter silence is also emphasized. And if action is also emphasized, it is not action as understood today. The action that is prescribed in integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo is an action that wells out of that silence. It is not an action which passes out as a result of desire and ambition and to acquire more and more and to possess more and more. Not that. The action that is prescribed in this yoga is an action that wells out of the intense silence of the being. It is like the Brahman itself. Brahman acts not because it is obliged to act. It acts because it is capable of acting. It is also one of the ways. And not only that, even when it acts, it remains inactive. And that is the nature of reality. It is not as if silence enters into activity, then it ceases to be silent for some time. As Aurobindo says, it is not as if 3/4 is inactive and 1/4 is active. It's not that. It's an integral reality in which even when the totality is in the field of action, the totality still remains inactive. That is the mystery and mastery of this reality. The reality, when you say reality is static and dynamic, it is not as if 3/4 is static and 1/4 is dynamic. It is such a reality that even in full dynamism, there is at the same time a total withdrawal from activity. Such is the nature of ultimate reality. Therefore, Aurobindo says that the experience of the inactivity is in any case indispensable, and one has to attain to it. And in the integral yoga of Aurobindo has given the indispensable part to this yoga by which inactivity can be experienced. Secondly, this doctrine of inactivity has given to India a great spirit of asceticism. Now, what is asceticism?